Thanks for the clarification. Since the International Court of Justice, ICJ has not declared Israel an illegitimate state, I can help you write a fictional or speculative script under the assumption that such an event occurred in a hypothetical future scenario. This could be used for a novel, play, political fiction, or academic thought experiment. The following script assumes a speculative world in which the ICJ has, under international pressure and after years of legal deliberation, issued such a ruling. In a historic and unprecedented move, the International Court of Justice today declared the state of Israel illegitimate, citing decades of international law violations and contested land claims. The decision followed a lengthy trial involving numerous testimonies, historical documents, and resolutions passed by the United Nations. While some see the ruling as a long overdue reckoning with the realities of displacement and occupation, others are calling it a seismic moment in the international legal order. The court cited the unresolved status of Palestinian statehood, unlawful settlements in occupied territories, and breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Although the ruling carries no direct enforcement power, its symbolic and diplomatic weight is immense. The verdict challenges foundational assumptions about statehood, sovereignty, and international recognition. Leaders across the globe are scrambling to interpret the consequences, with many calling emergency cabinet meetings and issuing guarded statements. The IC declaration will likely reverberate through international law for decades. Global reaction to the ICJ ruling was immediate and divided. Western governments issued cautious statements, with some expressing a concern over the legal basis of the decision, while others pledged to review bilateral relations. In contrast, much of the global south, particularly nations in Africa, Latin America and parts of Asia, praised the ruling as a long-awaited affirmation of Palestinian rights and international justice. Protests erupted across several capitals, both in support and opposition to the court's decision. Demonstrators waved flags, held up placards with messages like a justice for Palestine and ICJ over each, and in some cases clashed with police. Social media platforms saw unprecedented traffic as users debated the ruling's implications, with hashtags like #ICJVerdict and #Israel illegitimate trending globally. United Nations agencies prepared for diplomatic fallout, while the NGO warned of potential humanitarian crises arising from sudden policy shifts. The ruling not only intensified the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also exposed deeper fractures within the global community over international law and historical accountability. Within Israel, the response was one of defiance and disbelief. The Israeli Prime Minister delivered an urgent address to the nation, denouncing the ICJ ruling as biased, immoral, and null. He emphasized Israel's democratic values, its right to exist, and its contributions to science, technology, and humanitarian aid. Opposition leaders, while critical of the current administration's handling of international diplomacy, largely rallied behind the government's rejection of the verdict. Streets in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa filled with massive demonstrations, with citizens waving flags and chanting slogans defending national sovereignty. Some Israelis expressed fear over what the ruling might mean for travel, trade, and diplomatic recognition, while others vowed resilience and unity. Legal scholars in Israel began crafting rebuttals and planning appeals to other international bodies. The government also convened emergency meetings with its closest allies, attempting to mitigate the ruling's diplomatic consequences. Israel's political landscape entered a state of unprecedented uncertainty. The Palestinian Authority celebrated the ruling as a historic milestone, with crowds flooding the streets of Ramallah, Gaza City, and East Jerusalem. Fireworks lit the night skies, and speeches echoed through public squares praising the ICJ courage and moral clarity. Palestinian leaders hailed the judgment as a validation of decades of resistance and suffering. For many, the moment brought hope that years of displacement, occupation and statelessness might finally be addressed on the world stage. However, alongside celebration came concern. How would Israel respond? Would this ruling catalyze meaningful change or merely harden existing divisions? NGOs working in Palestinian territories issued statements urging calm, warning that any escalation could risk lives. The Palestinian Authority called for an emergency summit of the Arab League to discuss next steps, including potential pathways to full international recognition and reparations. Amid both jubilation and trepidation, Palestinians viewed the ruling as a turning point in their struggle for nationhood. The United Nations convened an emergency General Assembly session in response to the ICJ decision. Delegates from nearly every member state gathered to debate the legal, political, and humanitarian implications. Several countries called for the immediate establishment of a new international framework to mediate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in light of the ruling. Others proposed economic sanctions or travel restrictions for Israeli officials. The Security Council, however, remained paralyzed by veto threats from permanent members. The session grew heated as delegates exchanged accusations of hypocrisy, selective justice, and historical revisionism. The Secretary-General issued a call for restraint and dialogue, emphasizing the need for peaceful solutions and respect for human rights. Analysts observed that the ICJ ruling had reignited long-dormant debates on colonial legacies, self-determination, and the limits of state sovereignty. While no binding resolution emerged, the session underscored the urgency of redefining the global order to reflect principles of justice and accountability. International businesses and financial markets reacted sharply to the ICJ decision. Stock indices in Tel Aviv experienced steep declines, with the shekel plummeting to historic lows against the dollar and euro. Multinational corporations with significant operations in Israel issued statements of concern, while some began reviewing their exposure to legal and reputational risks. Defense contractors, tech companies, and energy firms were especially impacted as uncertainty gripped investors. Several global banks placed Israeli government bonds on watch lists, citing geopolitical instability and legal risk. Meanwhile, Palestinian markets, which have long been limited by occupation and blockade, saw an unexpected uptick in interest from sympathetic investors and regional partners. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund offered to convene emergency consultations to assess economic fallout and potential stabilization measures. The ruling cast a long shadow over Middle East economic integration efforts, raising questions about trade routes, resource management, and international finance ethics. Markets braced for continued volatility, and academics, legal scholars, and human rights organizations were among the most vocal in analyzing the implications of the ICJ's ruling. University panels, think tanks, and policy journals released preliminary interpretations and commentaries, framing the verdict as a landmark in international jurisprudence. Some scholars celebrated it as the first serious legal recognition of settler colonial dynamics in the modern state system. Others warned that declaring a state illegitimate, especially one recognized by the majority of the international community, set a dangerous precedent. Legal experts debated whether the ICJ had overstepped its mandate or whether it had finally exercised its moral authority to confront historical injustices. Human rights organizations published timelines of Israeli policies they argued justified the court's conclusion, including displacement, annexation, and systematic discrimination. The academic debate soon spilled into public discourse, with major newspapers dedicating entire editions to coverage and op-eds. In classrooms, cafes, and courts alike, the world was grappling with the meaning of legitimacy itself. Religious communities worldwide found themselves deeply impacted by the ICJ's ruling. In Jewish communities, especially within the diaspora, the decision caused a wave of anxiety, reflection, and in some cases, anger. Many feared a resurgence of anti-Semitism, pointing to historical patterns where criticism of Israel morphed into broader prejudice. Synagogues held special services, community leaders issued statements, and interfaith dialogues intensified. Meanwhile, many Christian and Muslim groups expressed support for the verdict, framing it as an opportunity for justice and reconciliation. The Vatican called for renewed commitment to peace and respect for all peoples in the Holy Land. In Mecca, influential clerics referenced the ruling in sermons, invoking solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Tensions also rose in mixed-faith cities, where the news sparked both solidarity rallies and counter-protests. The moral and spiritual weight of the ruling extended far beyond politics and law, entering the intimate spaces of belief, identity, and collective memory. Social movements around the globe seized the moment to push for deeper, systemic change. In South Africa, veterans of the anti-apartheid movement drew direct comparisons between their history and the ICJ conclusions about Israel. Protests and solidarity events occurred in London, New York, Jakarta, and Buenos Aires, with demonstrators demanding that their governments respond to the ruling with concrete action. The boycott, divestment, sanctions (BDS) movement experienced a dramatic resurgence, with cultural institutions, universities, and unions reconsidering their ties with Israeli counterparts. On the other hand, pro-Israel advocacy groups launched massive counter-campaigns, arguing that the ICJ ruling distorted history and undermined legitimate Jewish self-determination. The moment became a battleground for global narratives: colonialism versus democracy, law versus ideology, justice versus bias. For many, the ruling was not just about Israel. It was a test of the world's commitment to human rights and whether international law could be more than an empty promise. Inside Israeli settlements in the West Bank, confusion and fear took hold. Settlers feared that the IC declaration might be followed by international sanctions, arrests, or land reclamation efforts. Some communities began organizing convoys to relocate voluntarily, while others vowed to stay and resist. Clashes with Palestinian residents and activists increased, and international observers reported a rise in tensions and violence. The Israeli military, caught between domestic outrage and international scrutiny, tightened security around key flashpoints. Humanitarian organizations warned of potential mass displacements and shortages in basic supplies. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority appealed to the international community to ensure that any transitions of land or governance occur peacefully and under legal oversight. The prospect of dismantling settlements that had existed for decades posed enormous logistical, emotional, and political challenges. The reality of implementing the ICJ decision was proving to be far more complex than issuing the ruling itself. Diplomatic relations across the Middle East entered a new phase. Countries that had recently normalized ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords faced growing domestic pressure to reverse those agreements. Bahrain, Morocco, and the UAE called for strategic reviews, while Egypt and Jordan, longtime peace partners, issued ambiguous statements that walked a tightrope between diplomacy and domestic opinion. Iran and Hezbollah used the ruling as propaganda, declaring it a victory for the axis of resistance. Turkey and Qatar called for a new regional summit to address the changing landscape. The ruling also shifted alliances within Palestinian politics, with Hamas and Fatah both trying to claim credit for the diplomatic victory. Regional powers saw the potential for new influence, but also new conflict. The IC decision had not only altered Israel's diplomatic standing, it had redrawn the entire strategic map of the Middle East, forcing each actor to recalculate its role in an uncertain future. Despite the turmoil, some voices began to advocate for a visionary path forward. International mediators, including former diplomats, UN envoys, and civil society leaders, proposed the formation of a new transitional framework for both Israelis and Palestinians. The idea of a binational state, long dismissed as unrealistic, gained renewed attention. Others suggested a federated system or international trusteeship as interim solutions. For many Israelis and Palestinians, especially younger generations, there was growing recognition that the status quo was unsustainable. Painful as the ruling was for many, it created space to reimagine coexistence, justice, and long-term peace. Peace-building organizations increased their activity, fostering dialogues in local communities and creating platforms for shared visions of the future. Artists, poets, and filmmakers began processing the moment through new work, capturing both trauma and possibility. In the wake of the IC declaration, amid chaos and resistance, a fragile seed of reconciliation had been planted. Its survival would depend on what the world did next.